Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Fire Pit Chat with Ben and Joe. I'm Joe, and I'm joined by my friend Ben. Ben, how are you doing today?
Doing really well, Joe. Glad to be back.
Great. Well, we made a second episode. Maybe they said it may not happen, but it happened. And
Here we are.
here we are, for better or for worse. I want to thank everybody for great comments, feedback. Really appreciate it. Again, feel free if you hear something you like and it resonates, share it along. It's a public video on YouTube, so anything you want to do there and share it. If you have any thoughts or comments, throw them in the comments box. We will read them, and if you have some ideas for things for us to talk about, we'd love to do that. So, the topic for today is emotion. Are all emotions and feelings God-given? Are there bad emotions and good emotions? If everything given to us by God is good, what about the emotions like greed and envy? And what are emotions? Are greed and envy even emotions? So some groups claim there are four key emotions: joy, anger, fear, and sadness. Their belief is that every other emotion word rolls up into one of those. So the question is, where does love reside in the list? Can joy come from love? What about anger, fear, or sadness? Is love the one emotion that binds all the other emotions and ourselves together? So this topic started for me. I guess I've been a student of emotions for a long time because I've been labeled passionate and or dramatic sometimes, depending on who you're talking to. And so emotion. And I remember when I first started dating my wife, she had this poster on the wall, and it had, I don't know, 50 faces on it, and it said, "How are you feeling today?" And each face, it was a cartoon, each face had a different face, and it wasn't as simple as joy, anger, fear, or sadness. It was, I'm feeling complicated, or I'm feeling confused. And we would get into this debate. Well, and I would say, that's not really a feeling,
Mhm.
like,
Mm.
and I found myself, and I find myself in my life, my wife will say, "How are you feeling?" And I said, "Well, I'm feeling that you're mean." And eventually I realized that's not really a feeling. It's
Yeah.
really an attack against her. Like, that's not a feeling. And how many times in my life do I say I'm feeling something and it's not really a feeling?
Yeah.
And I just found over the course of my life that this understanding emotion and for me, I like those four definitions. For me, being able to take a feeling like I'm feeling confused,
Hmm.
but am I feeling confused because I'm angry about something, or am I feeling confused because I'm afraid of something?
Yeah.
And trying to bring it into one of those four columns, I found helps me get a better understanding. It just simplifies it for me and almost diffuses any kind of bomb that maybe is starting to
Yeah.
to fester inside.
Yeah. So I would love to dig into those two things you've just been talking about. One is one is labeling, precisely labeling emotions, and the other is owning them, not so that recognizing that my emotions are my emotions, instead of essentially accusing other people of accusing other people of my emotions, if I can put it that way.
Right.
But I wonder if before we get there, it might be helpful to take just a minute with the one question you have here, which is, what are emotions?
Mm.
Because I've been thinking about this since you sent me this question, and that actually is a pretty massive thing to think about. What what are these things? How does an emotion differ from, let's say, a pang of hunger or a sense of being really tired and needing sleep? Um, how do emotions differ from how does let's take the emotion of fear. How does the human emotion of fear, let's say, when you send your child out for the first time to drive alone, or you're seeing kind of potential problems in the stock market, those kind of fears, as opposed to the more obviously animal instinctual fear you might feel if something unexpected leaps at you out of, from some blind angle, that kind of fear you could recognize as an animal, kind of an animal instinct. But then there are these other fears that seem to operate differently. And I was just wondering if we could take a minute and just kind of dig into, like, what are these things?
What's interesting is, as you were saying that, I was thinking about some of these emotions, we'll call them emotions, feelings, whatever they are passive in me.
Yes.
And some of them are very active. And
Yes.
sometimes the same emotion in one scenario could be passive,
Hmm.
and other times it can be very active. I like, in terms of joy, I've never felt as much joy the moment my children were born.
Mm.
And it was so it was just so active. And then and so I think when you say what are emotions, I think it's also why are they active and passive? And I'm sure someone would tell you there's a chemical reaction that goes on in the brain, and I'm sure that's true. I don't know anything about it, but yeah,
But
I've noticed there's active and passive things depending on where I'm at and what drives that.
so to something you just said, I actually think it's pretty crucial to reflect on how emotions go beyond just brain chemical reactions. And this is where I actually think some of the understanding of human beings and how they work from the older kind of classical Christian tradition can be very helpful. So there is this kind of modern idea that human beings are essentially like everything else in the cosmos. They're just matter and energy doing what matter and energy do. We're just kind of protoplasm uh, functioning.
Mhm.
And I think as you begin to explore our consciousness and the feelings and things that go on in our consciousness, there's surely a lot more going on there again than just animal instinct. Someone once said it this way: two pop cans sitting next to each other fizzing, that's matter and energy. Two people having a conversation like you and I are right now, with the feelings and the passions and the desires and the repulsions that happen in relationships and in life. That there's there's a whole other dimension going on there.
Right.
And one way that some of the older writers used to talk about this is that basically human beings are created with appetites. Now, not just physical appetites, but appetites in the sense of an inclination toward something that they would have said created by God, with certain objects or ends toward which we incline. So, for example, the intellect seeks truth. Our will, our choosing faculty, seeks what is good. Like, we choose things because there's some sense that would be good. Just like our eyes seek what is visible, and our bellies seek what will nourish, and these faculties or appetites seek after something. And so passions or appetites are just a desire for a certain object. And so basically, all appetite, all desire, all passion kind of boils down to love. There's a perception that something's good. It draws me toward it. And when that thing shows up sort of in my field of vision, it comes before me, I'm drawn to it, or in some cases I'm repulsed by it. So, like, I was thinking about the word emotion. The word in the word is motion, right? Emotions are just, they're movement. They're a kind of movement of myself towards something, or a movement of myself away from something. And maybe that's one way of kind of understanding what's going on when you feel or you emote about something. And it gets to your point about love. Like, maybe you could say our emotional life really boils down to what are our loves. Does that make sense? I mean, it's
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And one of the things that I've looked at when I was part of a men's group about 18 years ago, was those four emotions, and that's where I was first exposed to that. And their belief was that each emotion has a fullness, or it's
yeah,
a healthiest acting out, and then has a shadow, and the
yes,
shadow is where where we act out. So when we look at at anger, as an emotion, it can be very positive. It can be
hmm
protecting, right? I protect my family, I protect my home, I
hmm
protect. And but in the negative, where I'm misusing that emotion, I can either be a sadist or the masochist. So I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to hurt myself. And
right,
so love falls into that sadness place. I think in a way, or connection, or sadness could be seen as grief. But I
hmm
think love covers all of those. But I
hmm
think that in its negative, or the shadow of love, is lust. So it
yeah,
could be that I think I love something, but I'm lusting after it. So it could still be love, but love in the shadow, my lusting for prestige or material things, or my lusting for another person, or
hmm
so
hmm
it may be love. And maybe part of that work is to to see that it's not love, it's lust,
Yeah.
and try to bring that out of from the shadow into the light, into its fullness of love, or stop doing it if it's lust and there is no positive to it. It's just
Right.
lust. I'm lusting
Yeah.
for this car or for this person. No, that's all that is. There's nothing more to be gained there. Just I have to let it go.
Yeah. Maybe another way of looking at that is what you are drawn toward, is what your emotion is moving toward with desire, is it actually truly good? I mean, I really do think we have to sort of ask ourselves about the objects towards which our emotions move, and really ask ourselves, is that in I might perceive it as a good, but is it actually truly good? um it's possible to love things that are actually destructive, or to love things that are actually far, far less important and valuable than the other things we ought to be loving but don't. Right? I mean,
Hmm.
um, or maybe to love a good thing the wrong way. There are ways of moving. I mean, we're both married men, and I think we would both could tell lots of stories about how I have had times when I love my wife, and sometimes I love her in just very bad ways. Like or I actually, I'm not even sure that's quite the right way of putting it. Uh, for example, maybe an example would be, let's say that I perceive my wife's done something that I think is wrong, and my sense of justice, my fur is up, and my sense of justice is all riled. There's
Right.
nothing wrong with the love of justice, but boy, that love of justice can turn you into some very vicious behavior.
Right.
I'm
Well,
gonna
that,
get I'm gonna get what's mine at all costs. I'm gonna right this wrong, at any cost. And so there's kind of a maybe an end toward what you're moving, which is good, but the way you're trying to get there is just destroying all kinds of other good things.
right. That's the shadow of anger. So
Yeah.
I get angry and I move to the shadow, which is I'm going to hurt you, not
Yes.
physically, but emotionally, or I'm going to withhold from you, and I'm going to move into the shadow. And so what I found is understanding these shadows and fullness of the emotions. So the first part for me was moving confused into which one of these four categories,
Yeah.
and then look at, am I in the shadow with this or am I in the light? So am I do I love you so much that I'm angry about something?
Mm-hmm.
And that could be love, and it could
Mm-hmm.
also be shadow. It could be, now I'm going to punish you.
Mm-hmm.
Could I love you so much that I'm scared about something, or in grief, love you so much that I'm grieving, and I think that's where love, is part of all these things. Obviously, I love you so much, I'm so happy and joy, and so I think there's understanding, and there's so much emotion going on today, even just in myself. And before we were chatting about it, is I found that without understanding emotion, and for me, bringing it back to if they're God given,
Mm-hmm.
then they have to be good. And so, the question is, am I using them for good, or am I using them for shadow or bad?
Right.
And so a lot of the emotion, and we talked last week about violence, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that some of these things can be like a tsunami, can be these emotions just come flooding up. And
Yeah.
then part of the work for me is trying to label it. Where is it, and what am I doing with it? Am I using it in the shadow or in the light?
Exactly. So, you mentioned earlier about owning my emotions, not blaming someone else. Like, you're making me feel this. I've actually been trying to work on never saying that. You're making me feel
Right.
what you are doing. I am feeling this. When you do that, I feel this. That's fair. But you're not making you're not
Right.
you're not making me angry. You're not making me sad. I'm being sad in response. Kind of just owning, but also to what you were just saying, not just owning, but also realizing that emotions can be trained.
Hmm.
The old idea, they can be habituated. You can develop a disposition toward, basically away from the shadow, right? Like you can learn to you can learn to you can learn to direct the motion of your emotions toward being constructive. But I think anger is probably one of the easiest places to see this. There's a very, very interesting verse in the Bible that says, "Be angry and don't sin."
Mm.
I've just thought about that so much. Like you said, God has made us in His image to be angered by injustice. In fact, if you're not angry about injustice, there's a sense in which you're kind of morally. That's actually a kind of moral malformation. If you can see injustice and it does nothing, like you feel nothing in response to it, that's not actually a great
Right.
place to be.
Right.
But of course, you and I, we've talked many times about how quickly anger can just turn into, like you said, a tsunami. So training. So what would you like? What are some of your thoughts on that training process? Like how do we kind of work with our emotions to stay out of that dark side?
Well, for me, it's breath. And I
Hmm.
remind myself, all right, take a deep breath. Anything I could say in 7 seconds, I could say now. So
Yep.
take that breath. And for me, what helped me was this framework. And by simplifying all that, because there are so many emotion words,
Yep.
trying to simplify it into four categories, and inside that breath, say, okay, what am I feeling
Hmm.
of the four? How could I translate this confusion?
Yes.
What am I feeling? Because confusion I can't work with. I can work with anger, because then I could say, okay, so I'm angry. Am I being a protector, or am I wanting to hurt or punish you, or am I want to hurt or punish myself? Am
Yep.
I feeling this because of sadness? And so is it grief that's going on? Could it
Yep.
be that I'm lazy and I'm unmotivated and I'm depressed, or addiction is generally sadness in shadow? So there could be,
Mhm.
if someone has an addiction, it could be they're stuck in that sadness feeling.
Yeah.
So part of the training is taking that deep breath and trying to remember, and or map this thing that's going
Yeah.
on inside my stomach to a label,
Yep.
which may or may not be a good thing. It works for me. And then from that label, say, okay, am I in the shadow, or am I in the darkness? If I'm in the darkness, I look for help, resources.
Yes.
It could be a prayer, it could be reaching out, could be calling a friend, could be
Yep.
writing something down. And if it's in the light, generally, if it's in the light, it's really in the shadow where it's trouble. When it's in the light, it's pretty pure, and I
Yep.
can work with it. I'm not looking necessarily to change it. And the
Hmm.
other thing, I got only to see this as a father when my children were little. I was amazed how they could go from crying, this deep curdling cry,
Yeah.
to laughing in a second,
Yeah.
back to crying and back to laughing. And now that I'm older, I forget if you believe, and I do, the children are purer emotionally than I am, then a lot of times I can move through this if it's pure,
Mm.
and I can move through these feelings or these emotions without putting an anchor in
Yeah.
and taking out my sword, if that's the
Yeah.
case, or shriveling into fear and hiding in the corner, or just breaking down and crying,
Yeah.
or so definitely agree with the training, and it takes effort and a desire, but that's not all. It needs a framework.
That's really profound. And I wonder if maybe part of the training process, then, in light of what you just said, is just learning not to clutch our emotions too tightly, almost sacralize them, if that makes sense. Like you can almost you can almost turn an emotion into a cause.
Absolutely.
And I have found when you can weep, like I've noticed this not just with children, but also in like at funerals. It's an interesting thing to watch the loved ones of the one who's passed. How in a few moments' time you'll see people just heaving sobs, and then a few minutes later they're remembering and laughing together. And there's something very beautiful about that. But I just wonder if part of it is just learning to allow the emotion to be and then allowing it to sort of release and move on, but not needing to camp on it. Like so often, anger that just, like you said, drops anchor and like, I'm just going to sit here and just sort of rage
Right.
interminably.
Right.
That's clearly the dark side, right? That's shadow.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, but I think even joy, a need to not just have joy, but almost experience euphoria, can lead you to weird places. Sadness that sort of just festers into despair or depression. It's just what you said is just very illuminating. Letting things go. Not. I don't mean that. I don't. I'm not saying get over it, but I mean
Right.
letting it go in a good way.
And there's a big difference. And I know letting it go, especially in some of the 12-step circles, can be, I won't necessarily controversial, but a point of struggle. And the idea is exactly what you said. It's not get over it, but it's let it go. And part of letting go for me is understanding my relationship to it, and
Mm,
what am I getting from it
mm.
that I can maybe get in a different way.
Yes.
That I'm not. So I may think I'm getting it from
Yes.
holding on to it. I may really not be, and the tell on that is that I'm miserable. You know,
And I
and
wonder if we could just take a moment and talk about how that relates to what we might call idolatry, like almost like worshiping something too much, where it's gone beyond a loving and appreciating something to almost like worshiping it, where if I lose this, I can't live, or if I don't have that, I can't live. You and I have talked so many times about kind of finding our anchor in God as the ultimate good, his love, his truth, his goodness as the place where our hearts can rest. And then that sort of releasing us from the need to maybe assign so much weight, so much value to something where, I mean, there's that verse in the book of Job where Job has kind of lost everything. And he says, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That he's grieving, he's weeping, he's in anguish, but he's not in despair, because he has that fundamental love of God, who is the ultimate good. There's a psalm that says, who do I have in heaven but you? And there is no one on earth I desire besides you. You are the strength of my heart and my portion forever. That sense of whatever else I may gain or lose, God does not change. He's the anchor of my soul. And so I'm able to love things with a kind of resiliency.
right. I agree. And for me, it comes back to, if it was everything given to us by God is good.
Mm.
So these feelings are good
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, right? It may
Right.
not feel good, but it's good. It's God's good. It's good in that sense. And
Yes.
so part of that letting go is that acceptance of that, and then the asking, okay, what am I to learn here?
Mm-hmm.
Or not? What am I just to experience? If I'm happy,
Yes.
hey, be happy.
Yes.
And be in that moment, because that's coming, if that's your belief, it's coming from God, and God's given. And instead of labeling bad, I'm angry, I got to get rid of this anger.
Right.
No, I may not necessarily have to get rid of the anger. Maybe I may need to move my anger from the shadow to the light,
Yes.
and as you said, be mad at injustice.
Mm.
But if I'm going to hurt myself by just rolling this over and over in my head, or hurt you by attacking you with my words and
Yeah.
thoughts, that's the problem with the anger. The anger is probably appropriate. God, that's from God. God is good. Anger is good. It's
Mm.
what I do with it.
Mm. Boy, I've just, where I've seen this so much is in working with my children. When they were little, they'd get upset about something, and like you said, children tend to just be very raw and sort of pure in their emotions. I mean, they're just feeling it, and it's all coming out, and they're screaming and flailing and whatever. And it's so easy as a parent to want to be like, kind of get your finger wagging in their face, like, you shouldn't be acting like this. You shouldn't be feeling this. And so often I just realize, quite often what they just need is, little guy, I know it hurts. Now let's just find something else to do, and you kind of lead them to think about something else, and they're over it in a few minutes. And I found the same thing with young adults. My kids are older now, and sometimes they just need an arm around the shoulder to say, you know what, it hurts. This just hurts, and we can sit here and we can cry, and then we can also move on with life. And I don't need to sort of like shut you down and make you stop acting like that and stop feeling that, and what's your problem? Because when you challenge emotion, sometimes you're just, like you were saying, the feeling's there. Like, it kind of just has to rise and fall. And if you're trying to like sort of play whack-a-mole with emotions in your children, you end up just really frustrating them.
Or if the conversation is from both places of shadow, that will never resolve.
Exactly.
If I want to hurt you with my words and you want to hurt me with your words,
Right.
we're now both angry, but we're both in shadow, as opposed to what you're saying, which is let's name the feeling and let's
Mm.
talk about it. But let's try to talk about it in the light. And in
Right.
the light is what is that emotion, that pureness that God gave us. And from the light, we can have that connection or that conversation.
Mm.
And that's probably where love, I think, is the glue, or love that comes
Yeah.
in then. And we can both be angry, but instead of trying to beat each other up, we're just honoring our own anger and then bringing the love to it.
Yeah.
And then in the light, as opposed to the other negative emotions, if we're in the shadow fight, it'll never resolve.
Yeah. That there's that idea somewhere in the Bible. It talks about love covers a multitude of sins. Like, it's just cover it. Like,
Right.
we're in the light. We don't need to We don't need to go to war over these things because we're moving our emotions, as it were, toward a higher good, which is reconciliation and peace and mutual support, as opposed to just the disintegration between us that happens when, like you said, your shadow and my shadow are just like duking it out. And I've been there, man. Ugh.
Those are usually the conversations that are just ugly for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, those just
Oh,
there's never a point. And sometimes I'll feel inside of myself, don't say that, don't
Mm.
say that, don't say that.
Mm.
And then this part comes up for me and just like, brr, and I say what I know I shouldn't have said, and then I regret it. But it's that shadow part, that part that either wants to hurt the other person or hurt myself. Anger was always huge for me, and that's the one I'm probably the most keyed into
Same.
for me. And I used to think I was just always angry, but the truth was I was all those feelings, but anger was the easy
Yeah.
place for me to go.
Yes. Yes. It's kind of empowering.
Yes, when I feel fearful and weak and helpless, if I shift to anger, I can bring out this warrior guy who's not very nice, but it covers up that fear. And so some of the work was understanding that underneath my anger, there was other things that until I dealt with those, I was just going to be angry all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I almost hesitate to mention this because not everyone had the same reaction to the film, but that I thought was one of the real insights in the film Inside Out, was the idea
Mhm.
that sadness should not be banished from our emotional palette, as it were, right? Or anger. Like these are they're there, and they reflect actually something about God's own image in us, that there are things that are not as they ought to be, and the fact that we feel that is actually okay, deeply okay, the sign of normalcy. But then, as you said, just how to not have that turn into shout. I mean, Jesus, you think about Jesus, he never sinned. He was angry and he was sad.
Mm,
That's
yes.
very telling.
And fearful, right?
And fearful. There was a kind of anguish as he anticipated, going to the cross, for example. And the Bible just speaks of him as being depressed, like really weighed down, but not ever in the shadow.
Right. And I think it's, for me, that's what I've been looking at and continue to look at, because I'm never done. I think I finally understood that now at my age, that I will never attain that, at
Yes.
least on this earth.
Right.
And even that is okay. And it sounds funny to say it, but it's really internalizing and accepting that. Because I've been saying that for years, but I didn't really believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm starting and warming up to that belief, and I forget it. And I have to remind myself when I think I've got it all worked out and everyone else around me doesn't know what they're thinking or doing or
Yep.
feeling, and I know what everybody's feeling and how to fix it.
Yep.
You have to remember that one thing I know for sure is I don't know anything. you know?
Well, and I think part of emotional health is just kind of getting beyond that perfectionism. That if I just sort of twisted my insides into a little more of a pretzel, I would just get the configuration exactly right. There's something freeing about realizing I'm growing emotionally. I have ups and downs emotionally. I slip into the shadow. I need to, turn from that and come back into the light. That's how it really is, and just not sort of clutching at this ideal in myself and others. Like if we were all could get our act together, we wouldn't have these feelings, and everything would kind of reach this stoical,
Right.
kind of
Boring.
yeah, boring, bland. Nothing ruffles us. I mean, that actually is an ideal in some philosophies, and I just don't think that's how God made us at all.
Right.
So
Right. Well, yeah. I go back to that. If it's given by God, then that it enriches all these feelings,
yes.
whether it's these four or the 89 other ones.
Mm-hmm.
They enrich our lives,
Mm-hmm.
especially in shadow. And the shadow part is where the growth comes.
Yeah.
So I need to accept that I have a shadow part, and that the shadow part will play itself out. And when God reveals that to me, that's my opportunity to grow. But
Absolutely.
without these feelings, life wouldn't be very enriching. It would be boring,
I
right?
I think it might be actually kind of intolerable.
Yes.
I mean, imagine a life with no joy, no sadness, no anger, even no fear. If nothing was interesting enough to even cause a sense of I that that elicits fear in me. I mean, it would be a very strange world.
Yeah. Well, probably have a lot of broken bones and car accidents,
Yeah.
and fear keeps us, in one piece.
Sure.
I think a lot of times.
Yeah, it's a kind of wisdom.
Yeah, it was a concept early on in my recovery. We talked about, there's a healthy fear. There are some fears that are really healthy to have. Like, example, don't put your finger in the light socket. That's a pretty healthy fear, you know?
Yeah. Yep.
Um, so I think all within their place, and that's the part that's God given. And then it's when because of a lot of probably different things, when I drop into shadow, there's my opportunity to grow. But that's also where I find the angst.
Hmm.
And this all sounds good. I know as we're talking, and I probably do this 5%, maybe 10% of the time. So this is just an ongoing
Yeah.
experience of life for me, and
Yeah.
I have to remember that and ask God for help with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really do think, as communities, as families, as friends, um, there's a lot to be done with just learning how to talk about our emotions, not in some weird, constantly psychoanalyzing each other sort of way, but just being able to have enough trust and enough interest in helping one another, and even lovingly challenging each other to just sort of lay things out on the table and say, this is what I'm feeling, and I think this is why, and walking together through those things. I've been so enormously helped by that over the years.
Yeah. And I think if we get to the light part of that feeling, I can say this is what I'm feeling, and going back to what we said earlier, then not latch you into it as the cause of it.
Right. Right. Exactly. Where we're right. And absolutely. So much to say about that. This is a big topic. So yeah.
It is. It is, but it's in that piece when I own it for myself, that's we're in the light, we're not in the shadow, and then it can be.
Yes.
And as opposed to going back to last week, a weapon that I use, whether it's my beliefs, these there are emotions behind all those beliefs. And so, yeah, when I can just state it and own it, name it and claim it, that's when real connection can happen, at least in my experience, when real connection does happen.
Be interesting sometime maybe to do another episode even on how to manage these emotions during a disagreement, because this is
Yeah.
all easy on the, we've stepped to the sidelines, we're having a talk, sitting on the bench, but in the middle of the game, as it were, being self-aware about emotions and learning how to direct them and even open up about them in the middle of a disagreement, that's an art.
Yeah, and it requires, at least in my experience, this desire to be I need a desire to be vulnerable at the very moment I do not want to be vulnerable.
Precisely. Yeah, absolutely.
And
And
that's the art piece, because I've got to make that decision. Okay, I'm gonna be vulnerable, and I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna get out of the shadow here. I'm
yep.
gonna bring it to the light, and I may get clubbed to death, but I'm gonna
Yep.
do that.
Yep.
And it's at the very in that moment, that's the last place I want to be when I'm
Yep.
mad or feeling attacked. The last place I want to be is vulnerable. But when
Yep.
I do that, those few times,
Yep.
great things can happen. Not all the time, but a
But
lot
very
of times
often.
great things happen.
Yeah, I've even found this, in the heat of talking with, we've got teens in the house, and sometimes things really get fiery, and just being able to say, even to my kids, in a very moment of, confrontation about something, just say, I'm not really handling my emotions very well right now. I'm feeling a lot of whatever, and I just want you to know I'm aware of this. I'm awake on my end. I know it can't be fun to be on the receiving end of me right now, and
Right.
even just that much honesty seems to take just kind of some of the electricity out of the air, and you realize we're two human beings trying to work this out, and it just calms things down a bit. So
Absolutely, absolutely, and one mentor of mine said, retreat is a viable offense,
yes.
and there will be times where I'll just say to my wife, "Hey, you didn't do anything wrong.
Yep.
I need to step outside and get some air,
Yep.
and just separate myself and try to get back to my shadow with light here. What's
Yes.
being threatened or what feels threatened? What do I need to do? Which is different than saying, get away from me and storm me out of the house, right?
Or just trying to shut my emotions off
Right.
as a way of dealing with somebody. So yeah, certainly not attacking the other person because I'm having feelings, but also not trying to just, kind of screw down my lid to the point where I don't have nothing comes out ever again. I mean, I want these emotions to be in the relationship just in a healthy way. So
Yeah, and for me, it's also giving myself permission to be overwhelmed by these
yeah.
emotions, because it
Yep.
happens.
Yep.
And at that point, to be able to be okay with that and not then bring more emotion of judgment against myself for being whatever, weak, stupid, whatever,
Yep.
just give myself the permission. And that's where sometimes I've been trying of late, because there's a lot of emotions going on right now, I think, throughout the society and the world, is that I will be overwhelmed, and it's okay for me to retreat back,
Hmm.
with that intention. And a lot of times
Mm.
I bring prayer into that, meditation into that, and be okay with there's just a lot of emotions going on. There's nothing
Yep.
bad here. These emotions are God given, and eventually I'll know how to deal with them by
Right.
retreating back instead of continuing this onslaught against myself or others.
And maybe that positions us then in a very, very emotionally charged time to be able then to reach out to people who maybe are just completely acting out, whatever emotion, whatever outrage they're feeling in the moment, to be able to kind of reach out to them and maybe, experience something of what the Bible means when it says that a soft answer turns away wrath, or, a soft tongue breaks the bone. There is a kind of what looks like weakness, but it's actually immense strength that can
Right.
diffuse things.
So I know you were talking about your kids. I learned that early on with my daughter, my oldest. She was colic for 6 months, and man, she just didn't stop crying. So one day, my wife, God bless her, really did a great job with her, and I was working, and so my wife really was on the front lines of that. So one night she said, "I'm going to go out. I just need you to be with the baby," and I'm like, "No problem." And of course, she started crying and crying and crying, and I was like, "I can do this. This is good. I'm good."
Yeah.
And she kept crying, and finally, I found myself. I was just completely overwhelmed. So I put her in the crib, closed the door, and I started shaking. And I said, "Okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm the father. I'm the dad. I can handle this. She's my daughter. I love her." And I went back in there and I'm holding her, and she's just screaming in my ear. And it was at that point I realized I can't give what I don't have.
Yes.
I had nothing to give, and here I was beating my head against this notion that I should be able to
Yep.
overcome this emotion by sheer will, and
Yep.
I couldn't. So I
Yep.
put her down and I ran and called my wife and begged her to come home because I realized I was so jammed up, and
Yeah.
I can't give what I don't have. And if I don't have that center, I can try to tell myself what a father is or what a man is or what society
Mm.
says I should be, but if I don't have it to give, I can't, and I'm just going to keep failing and failing and failing
Yeah.
until I stop, retreat, take a deep breath and be like, okay, this, and get back to myself, to that center, and ask for help like I did with my wife.
Yeah. I absolutely. And I just, I, I grew up, my parents always talking about, pray about stuff, Ben. And it just seems so pious and, out of touch even at the time. But as I've gotten older, I've realized if you don't think you can be overwhelmed, you probably just haven't lived long enough yet. There will be things in your life that are just going to be like seawater just washing you away. And
Right.
if you do not have a relationship with God where you can just cry out from those depths and say, I'm sinking. And if you don't have relationships in your life where you can do, like you reach out to your wife or a friend or whatever, you can just say, listen, I cannot get my feet under me. I just need you to pray for me. I just need to vent for a few minutes. Like this idea of complete emotional self-sufficiency, I actually think is some people might attain to it. I certainly haven't. And I think it probably is a little bit of a myth. If certain things happen in our lives, they are genuinely overwhelming. What happens inside of us is overwhelming. And I think early on developing those resources are turned to, it's just a big part of our development. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And when I'm overwhelmed, and people may be overwhelmed right now, and I have days where I'm very overwhelmed, I have to remind myself there's nothing wrong.
Right.
It's just another feeling. It's
Right.
just now
Right.
feeling overwhelmed.
Sure.
And
But even
and
someone
so
saying that to you, don't you find that even someone saying that to you is helpful? Like I've had times when I'm like losing my mind. My wife will say, Ben, it's it's not the end of the world. You're just really stressed, and it's bad, and you'll wake up tomorrow and it's okay. We'll get through it. And I just even hearing that, it's like, okay, the apocalypse is not now.
right,
you know.
right. Absolutely, because I think it brings it back to the light again.
Right.
Anything that brings it back to the light brings it into God's arena, I
Right.
think.
Right.
And so, yeah, it is. And just like I said, just really giving myself the permission, and then extending that permission out to others to be overwhelmed and stressed. And sometimes one of my sponsors said, learning when to shut up.
Yep.
That other person's overwhelmed. They don't necessarily need to hear from me how to fix it. They just
Yes.
need to be, or
Yes.
like you said earlier, vent, say whatever they need to say, be in that emotions, and work through it.
Yep. Yeah, because again, it's not this perfectionism that, you should be here now. Well, you actually are here now, and let's just start there and start walking toward the light.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So that last question, is love the one emotion that binds all the other emotions in ourselves together? I would say yes.
Yeah, as would I. As would I. And I think all emotion is rooted in love at some level, like we were saying earlier. And it certainly seems to me that the love of God and the love of one another, and learning to have well-ordered loves, is really where we find that kind of ordering of the emotional life that brings peace.
Amen to that. All right. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for hopefully you stuck with us this long, and appreciate everybody again. Any comments, feedbacks, love to hear that. We'll be back again with another episode. We've got some more topics we're going to work through and speak through. And again, anybody, if you feel motivated or you feel like you want to share this, feel free to share it. We just something that Ben and I do and offered freely to everybody out there. So Ben, thanks a lot. This was great.
It's been a pleasure, Joe.
All right. We'll be back next time. And again, everybody, thanks for sticking with us. Bye-bye.